And so we realized we were going to have to engage politically. Also, it's a known fact for folks who have kind of studied this stuff. Conservatives went local a long time ago. This would be nothing new if we were talking amongst Republicans or conservatives. They were putting money into city council races decades.
Hi there, I'm Jesse Mayshark, and this is Headlights, Voices from the Progressive South. Headlights is a production of The Progressive South, a nonprofit media platform dedicated to amplifying progressive voices and values across the southern United States. Voices like Brandon Jones, Director of Political Campaigns for the Southern Poverty Law Center Action Fund. That was his voice you heard up top. Jones is based in Mississippi, and he is heading up an effort to support progressive candidates in local races like city council and school board across the Deep South. My interview with him is coming up later in the episode. In our arts and culture segment, we'll preview a big annual festival taking place this weekend in Athens, Georgia. But first, before we get to our news roundup, I just want to say a few words about events broadly. We're recording this on Friday, June 13th, and it has been a tumultuous week. The protests and standoffs over immigration enforcement and military troop deployment in Los Angeles, including the tackling and handcuffing of California Senator Alex Padilla by federal agents, have fueled tension across the country. For progressive-minded Americans, this is a challenging time. Many of the values and principles we believe in, like the rule of law, the protection of civil rights, the value of diversity in our multicultural society, feel under siege. For those of us in the South, as I've said in prior episodes, that sense of siege is not new, but it is certainly heightened by the national events. I know some people are afraid of where things are headed. Some people are furious about it, and some are simply exhausted by the barrage. I just want to reiterate some of the things that guests on this podcast have said in prior episodes about the importance of finding ways to connect with others at grassroots community levels, the value of continued awareness and action even when it feels overwhelming, and of course the importance of taking care of yourself too. It's okay to take a break when it all feels like too much. The fight will still be there when you return to it. Everything we are fighting through now are things that we in this country have fought through before. Every one of those fights was hard, and many of them were bloody, but people went and stood up anyway for what they knew in their hearts was right. And so here we are again, and we have to do it again together. Okay, on to our news roundup. This week, we're taking a look at the growing power of the anti-vaccine movement in southern states, where many legislatures in recent years have taken steps to weaken public health mandates. Vaccine skepticism is not a new phenomenon. It dates back to the introduction of the first vaccine for smallpox at the end of the 18th century. Because the vaccine derived from a related disease that affected cows, cowpox, many people feared that injecting it might harm them and even turn them part bovine. In the United States, vaccine science became more widely accepted after World War II, following the undeniable success of vaccines against polio and measles, mumps, and rubella. But vaccine hesitancy, as public health officials call it, persisted as a kind of fringe phenomenon for decades, among some specific religious groups and in alternative healthcare circles, particularly on the cultural left with its built-in suspicions of profit-driven pharmaceutical companies. As we all know, the COVID pandemic and the vaccine mandates that followed it brought vaccine resistance back to the forefront. Although initially focused on the COVID vaccines specifically, the movement has brought along with it a broader suspicion of immunization. It has also found a new political home on the conservative right. Obviously, nobody embodies that shift more than Robert F. Kennedy Jr., our current Secretary of Health and Human Services in the Trump administration. A vaccine skeptic who has long advanced the notion that childhood immunization may cause autism, a claim for which there is no scientific evidence, Kennedy in the last few months has moved to radically shift the federal government's approach to vaccination. Just last week, he fired the government's entire vaccine advisory board and named new members to it who include some prominent vaccine skeptics. Public health officials have raised alarms about the implications for preventing outbreaks of deadly diseases. But as in many other areas of policy being undertaken by the Trump administration, southern states have been ahead of the curve. In the years since the COVID outbreak, many have taken steps to weaken vaccine mandates, not only for the COVID-19 vaccines, but for vaccines in general. And who else would be leading the way than Florida? Governor Ron DeSantis positioned the Sunshine State as a haven from public health restrictions at the height of the pandemic. In 2022, he appointed a new state surgeon general, Joseph Ladapo, who had written opinion pieces raising questions about COVID vaccines and endorsing unproven treatments like ivermectin, which have been found useless against the disease. In 2023, Ladapo was formally criticized by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and the U.S. Food and Drug Administration for promoting unfounded fears about the COVID vaccine. And in 2024, during an outbreak of measles at a Florida elementary school, he was criticized again for telling parents of unvaccinated children to make their own decisions about whether to send their kids to school anyway, contradicting standard CDC guidance. Although Florida does require a full set of childhood immunizations to enroll in public school, the state allows parents to apply for a religious exemption from vaccination at their local health department. Those are essentially granted upon request. And all of the rhetoric from the state's leaders is having an impact. Last year, the CDC found that Florida had the highest percentage of unvaccinated kindergartners in the country, at 4.5%. The vast majority of them were granted religious exemptions. 4.5% might not sound like a big number, but the general medical consensus is that you need to maintain 95% vaccination in a population in order to have what's called herd immunity, meaning that in the event of an outbreak, enough people are vaccinated to keep it contained and not spread widely. But Florida is not alone in its weakening of protective standards. Just a few months ago, Louisiana's Surgeon General, Ralph Abraham, announced that the state would no longer encourage or promote vaccinations. In a social media post, Abraham called public health campaigns to encourage immunization a product of, quote, collectivist ideologies willing to sacrifice a few for the greater good. Abraham is a veterinarian and a physician, and maybe more to the point, a former Republican congressman from Louisiana and failed candidate for governor. He was appointed Surgeon General last year by the state's new Republican governor, Jeff Landry. His embrace of vaccine skepticism was widely denounced by national medical experts, particularly given that it came as a measles outbreak was underway in neighboring Texas. And speaking of Texas, as of last week, that outbreak had spread to 744 cases since January, concentrated in West Texas, with 96 of those requiring hospitalization. 2 children have died. But even as measles flared, the Texas State Legislature took action to make it easier for parents to opt their children out of vaccination requirements. The state will now have a downloadable form to request an exemption from childhood vaccines. Previously, parents seeking an exemption had to request an affidavit from the state and then get it notarized, which could take several weeks to complete. Even with the existing rules, requested exemptions in the state more than doubled from 2018 to 2024, rising from 45,000 to 93,000. State officials say all requests are granted. All someone has to do is affirm that vaccination is against their beliefs. With the ease of print and file exemption forms, officials expect the number to rise some more. Of course, all of these options and exemptions come at a potential cost. In the case of the COVID vaccine, Alabama had the second lowest vaccination rate among states as of 2024, and the 5th highest death rate per capita. Mississippi had the 3rd lowest vaccination rate and the highest per capita death rate. Tennessee had the 5th lowest vaccination rate and the 8th highest death rate. You get the idea. The point is that those kinds of statistics seem likely to grow in our states if the anti-vaccination movement really becomes a core part of the modern conservative coalition. Brandon Jones is Director of Political Campaigns for the Southern Poverty Law Center Action Fund and its affiliated super PAC, New Southern Majority. The SPLC, of course, is a storied Southern institution, a legal advocacy nonprofit founded in 1971 to pursue civil rights and public interest litigation. It went through a rocky spell over the last 10 years with the ouster of co-founder Morris Dees over complaints from staff about inappropriate behavior. That shakeup, which also included the resignations of the president and legal director, led to a reevaluation of the organization's goals and approaches. One result was the creation of the Action Fund and Super PAC, which are 501c4 political organizations that are separate from the SPLC itself, an important distinction as we talk about their political activities. Jones, who is based in Jackson, Mississippi, has been with SPLC in various capacities for the past 6 years. He is a graduate of Mississippi College who earned a Master's of Divinity from Wake Forest before earning a law degree from Mercer University in Georgia. He has political experience of his own. He served in the Mississippi House of Representatives for 4 years, from 2008 to 2012. Now he's engaging from a different direction. The SPLC Action Fund is interesting as a multi-state political effort because it is aiming at grassroots levels. It endorses and supports candidates in local races for city councils and school boards, rather than the more high-profile state and federal races that attract the most funding and attention. In particular, it supports candidates who are committed to voting rights, criminal justice reform, social safety net programs, public education, and protecting democracy. In 2024, the new Southern Majority Super PAC helped elect progressive candidates to 2 Florida school boards, as well as the first black sheriff of Caddo Parish in northwestern Louisiana. It is one concrete way that a Southern group is trying to bring more progressive candidates into positions of leadership. So, Seth, let's go to the tape.
So, joining us now is Brandon Jones. And first of all, Brandon, thanks so much for giving me a few minutes here. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, Jesse, good to be with you.
So, I read your intro there a little bit, and kind of an interesting combination, I think, of having both the divinity degree and the law degree. I was wondering if you could just talk to me a little bit about your background. Where did you grow up? And then kind of how did you find your way into law and then into the work that you're doing now?
Sure. Well, grew up in Pascagoula, Mississippi, Gulf Coast town, there between Mobile, Alabama, and Biloxi, Mississippi. So spent, my early days on the Gulf Coast, and was always interested in law and politics and things of that nature. I didn't have a especially active political family, but I had a curious family. And so, newspapers were part of our life, and we would have conversations about all variety of issues. And I'm grateful to have been raised in a house where we were encouraged to think about that stuff and talk about it and oftentimes argue about it. That was a big part of my growing up. So I, faith is important to me. You mentioned the divinity degree. That's been true throughout my life. And I've been part of 3 different denominations and have worked on staff at churches. And pretty early pivotal experience for me was working for the Baptist Joint Committee there in Washington, D.C., which is now sort of leading the way in the fight against white Christian nationalism. So I'm really proud of the work that they do. And to live on Capitol Hill in 2000 was exciting. I mean, that was a big election year. And so I think, all of my interest in student government and student politics kind of set me up to be excited about national politics when I was there in D.C. Volunteered for some campaigns that did go ahead and finish out my divinity degree, but kind of knew the whole time that I wanted to go to law school. Was lucky to meet at the Baptist Joint Committee folks who had done both. That was a pretty common dual degree situation there. So really, Jesse was interested in child advocacy. I went to work for CASA in law school, thought I would do, some type of children's defense fund type work, some type of child advocacy. So that was kind of there. And moved back to the coast just in time to get waylaid by Katrina and shifted gears a little bit. Got into plaintiff's law and sued insurance companies for a while. And so, and really enjoy doing it. I think insurance companies need to be held to account. And so that's, and of course, growing up on the Gulf Coast and seeing what happened to people and the issues that they faced in terms of rebuilding their lives, turned me on to local issues. So I ran for the Mississippi State Legislature, served in the state legislature for 4 years, People are always surprised to hear that, from 2008 to 2012, Democrats had a majority in the Mississippi state legislature. So I was part of a very narrow majority. Haley Barbour was our governor at that time. He's a bit of a national figure, was in the Nixon White House, party chair, for quite a while, and kind of a national figure. So I spent a lot of time in the Mississippi Legislature fighting with Governor Barbour, and gave the Democratic response to his State of the State back during that time. And, look, from there, it just kind of, I had the bug. I was interested in politics. I will say this, even though I've been on the ballot before and enjoyed my term of service, have always enjoyed the process of finding people to run and encouraging people to run and supporting people who are holding these very difficult jobs, particularly in the South. And so when I came to the Southern Poverty Law Center, I came primarily as a lobbyist and as a policy person. For about 10 years now, I've been a policy analyst and political analyst for Mississippi Public Broadcasting, our NPR affiliate. And so these are issues that are interesting to me. I've taught policy as an adjunct professor and I'm curious about all that stuff. And so that was a good fit for me. Have always appreciated the work the Southern Poverty Law Center has done. I mentioned to you reading the newspaper around the kitchen table in Pascagoula. One of the stories we read was about the SPLC suing the Klan whenever I was a kid. And I have vivid memories of my dad and I saying, well, it's kind of interesting, suing the Klan, and that being something that one would do. So SPLC was a bit in my imagination for a while. When I started my law career, they did not have a Mississippi office. But thankfully they did whenever it made sense for me to go into nonprofit work. And a few years back, we launched a political arm, which I'm sure you and I will talk about, where we do endorsements and work on campaigns. So I hope that's helpful. Probably talked longer than you wanted.
No, that's all great. And, as an old newspaper guy myself, I'm always happy to hear people talk about the importance of reading the newspaper. I don't, 20, 30 years from now, I don't know what those stories are going to be. It's going to be, I grew up scrolling through TikTok and I don't know where people are going to find that. Hopefully they're finding it somewhere. So let's talk about the Action Fund and the new Southern Majority, which is a very ambitious name, obviously, for a super PAC. What prompted? The SPLC itself has obviously been active in lots of ways for a long time. What prompted this idea, and why now to kind of set up this separate arm to really get directly involved in political races?
Yeah. So I think most people know the Southern Poverty Law Center through our work in courtrooms and through our work with the Intelligence Project, where we've, tried to track hate groups throughout the country for quite a while. And that's an important resource that was just published. This year's version just came out last week, by the way. Urge people to take a look at that. And we did. I would say, I don't think it's incorrect to say that for the early decades, the first 30, 40 years of our existence, we primarily functioned as a civil rights law firm. We were primarily staffed by lawyers. Most of our staff, it's now we're getting to a little bit more balance in our staffing, but for a long time, we were a very large civil rights law firm, primarily filing cases in the Southeast, although not exclusively. We realized, and then whenever the Action Fund initially started its work, our primary purpose work was lobbying. And so we set up lobbying shops at to lobby state legislatures in the 5 states where we work, which are Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, and Georgia, just right there along the southeastern coast. And I will say I'm very proud of that policy work. If you go to those states now, the SPLC Action Fund was responsible for building pretty robust lobbying efforts in each of those states and have been a part of defeating bad legislation in all of those places and passing good bills in all of those places. So, that was kind of where we started to expand into some of our C4 work. Well, we increasingly realized after 2016, and really we're coming to understand this before that time, that it doesn't really matter how good you are at filing lawsuits or how effective you might be at lobbying one or two individual legislators. It is very difficult to move an irretractable MAGA elected official or someone who has just dyed in the wool against doing anything progressive. And so we realized we were going to have to engage politically. Also, it's a known fact for folks who have kind of studied this stuff. Conservatives went local a long time ago. This would be nothing new if we were talking amongst Republicans or conservatives. They were putting money into city council races decades ago. Whenever they have not had success at the federal and state level, they've always gone. Democrats and progressives have been really slow to catch on. We have not been as effective at building out local infrastructure and at putting money into local races. So in some ways, we saw the opportunity to do this work on the progressive side as just a real wide open opportunity that's been there for decades and an opportunity to make up some real lost ground. Also, you mentioned earlier some of the issues that we care about. I think while we spend a lot of angst and ire focused on the federal government and what happens in our state houses and our governor's offices, we lose sight of the fact that so many of the issues and decisions that are made that affect our pocketbooks and that affect our freedom and that affect our schools are taking place in our neighborhood and right around the corner from home. These are local decisions. And finally, just strategically, I'll tell you this, there's not a lot of folks doing what we do. So we can go to places, big, small, otherwise, and say, hey, we want to work on this city council race. We don't have a lot of folks fighting us for that. There aren't a lot of groups who are already there. So we can come in and say, we would like to help get the first black mayor elected in such and such town. And people are happy to have us there because they weren't going to do it and they're not putting the money in races. So, there's all these strategic, philosophical, policy-based reasons to do it, but there's also just a real space here. And one of the things we did not want to do as we built out our political operation is spend a lot of time fighting leftist and progressive. I don't have a whole lot of patience for that. I've seen plenty of that at the party level. I've seen plenty of it at the local organizing level. And we decided to come in and say, you tell us where resources are not being allocated. We'll go there. And you tell us about races that you think are important, but you're not investing. We'll go there. And that's kind of been our model, and it's worked pretty well.
So you mean if there already is a strong operation somewhere, that might not be a place you would go to because you can make more difference, someplace that doesn't have that focus?
That's right. And so, we work really closely with these coalition groups and tables where they exist to make sure we're finding those spots. And it's not unusual for us to just go to these groups and say, you tell us. We're on the map. Is there just not any coverage? Where are races that need some resources? It's really, if we come in and we see that there's a robust third party effort somewhere, then we say, hey, great, we'll go to one of these other places. And a good example of that is we have people might be interested to know that we have elections popping off all over. So we just got out of elections in Louisiana, and we were working really excited about some of the work we did there. Next week, we have elections in Mississippi. Next month, at the end of the summer in August, there are elections in Alabama. So these municipal races take place across a curious calendar and kind of a patchwork quilt of times. Florida is voting every month. Florida has something on the ballot somewhere. It's the craziest election scheme you'll find anywhere in the country. It's almost as if it was designed for people to not know when their elections are in Florida. And here in Mississippi, there were some examples of what you just described where we kind of surveyed the field. We looked to see where there were places of opportunity. We look at this stuff through a racial lens, meaning that we look for where there's an appreciable black voting age population as sort of a threshold for where we will get involved. Because frankly, white folks in the South are pretty irretractable in politics, and they're only going to listen to so much out of me. So we got to find places where we can be persuasive. So we start with places that have a good number of black voters and try to figure out, where these sweet spots and opportunities are. And in some of those places, I'm really excited to let you know there were good third parties. There were people who were doing work to help candidates and to advance the cause in some of these places. And so in those places, there wasn't a need for us, and we were able to go to other places. And, hopefully we'll see fruits of that next week when the results come.
So obviously, when you win an individual race, like, for example, some of those school board seats in Florida last year, I know in one case there was a strong Moms for Liberty candidate who was ousted. You win that office and you have a more progressive office holder in that particular place. But can you talk a little bit about the broader, capacity building side of this? Because the other thing, it seems to me, that exists in a lot of places is there isn't necessarily maybe a strong party infrastructure. There are people who kind of feel like they would like to be engaged, but they don't feel like they can make a difference. I guess, does winning one race somewhere have a broader ripple effect within that community in terms of just helping people to feel like they can get engaged and can make a difference?
I'll start with that last piece of the question. Yes. I mean, we've seen, what can happen sometimes is when someone gets elected that voters are surprised by, or they might live in a place where they didn't think that their candidate, that it was possible for the candidate to win. It can have a real effect on the way they look at local government. And it can make them kind of sit up and say, we thought this was a lost cause. Now we see our preferred candidate can have some success. And it has sparked renewed engagement. So sometimes campaigns and candidates can be special. And, one of the things that we realize is we never win a race by ourselves. All we can, because we don't coordinate with campaigns and candidates, we work independently. And all we can do is accent an otherwise good campaign or an otherwise good candidate. And sometimes those folks come in and can have that kind of change. But what I heard you getting at is, what are we doing to make sure that once these people get in office that they're good at these jobs? Which is a conversation that's taking place across the country in progressive circles about how some of the things that we've been talking about for decades might not have been yielding fruits that one would expect, given the fact that we've held some of these offices for a long time. This is a huge point of emphasis for us. And I will tell you that right now, we are thinking about what would it look like to staff these people that we help to get elected, at least to have a liaison on our team to help provide policy assistance, to help connect them up with others who are doing this job in other places. If you're a new member of the city council, to perhaps make sure that you're aware of what that process looks like and what has been successful in other cities that have tried some things. Just to be a resource for those, because I feel like that's one of the biggest gaps we have, is in the governance support piece of this. Because, as you mentioned, in many cases, these jobs are part-time. In many cases, there's no budget for a staff. And if there is, it's bare bones, and it's primarily doing the administrative work of the city or the government. And so that leaves very little opportunity for the kind of policy development, advocacy development that's necessary to do these jobs in dynamic ways. And so we're thinking about that. We recognize that as a real gap.
And
we recognize that as
that again is something that has existed on the right for a long time, right? I mean, there's sort of like no end of conservative think tanks, policy groups, state level conferences, national conferences that even local office holders are, as soon as they take office, they start kind of receiving these things and get invited to places. There's a whole kind of ecosystem there that I think exists much less on the left.
No question. They've put serious investment in those things you mentioned. I mean, we are all familiar across the country with ALEC. ALEC's a group that basically brings in conservative lawmakers and tells them what to pass in their states, and they dutifully leave ALEC and go and pass these bills in their states, and have been doing it for decades. Part of the problem is, and Jesse, you talk to folks like me long enough, you get to see this. We don't fall in line all that. It's just, if you're a progressive person, particularly a progressive person in the South, you didn't get there by being someone who gets a memo from a national organization and then goes home and doesn't ask any questions. And just so, Republicans have an advantage. People who are drawn to that kind of politics, they are kind of drawn to authoritarians and strong men. And, they can take their notes and go and off to do their job. Right. I do not meet a lot of liberals and progressives who operate that way. I mean, we're a little bit harder to bring in. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be resourcing these opportunities. As painful as getting us together in a meeting may be, we should be doing some of it. And we should be, at a minimum, offering basic level competency, training, and resources to people who are doing these serious jobs so that they are trusted to continue doing the jobs and so that our policy objectives can be. That's just a very basic concept. I think part of it is that building that stuff out is sort of like the eating your vegetables part of this type of work. A lot of groups are not excited about stopping to train school board members or stopping to think through the minutia of being a city councilor in an 11,000 person town. So part of what we're thinking is, how do we make that, first of all, more compelling to our partners so that they might be willing to join us in doing some more of this? And then, just kind of building out some type of apparatus and program and training to do as much of that as possible. And I want to be clear here, we're not the only ones thinking about this, and there are some groups who are doing some of this. But I think anyone who's in this space would recognize there's a gap here. It's certainly not being done on the scale that we need.
And what does this do in terms of sort of bench building? Because, one thing with these local offices is that's often where your next state legislator comes from, and then, all the way up to state level offices. I feel like this whole question of how deep is the bench, and especially for progressives in the South, that's a perennial problem. So does this also start to do that down at these grassroots levels?
It does. I will tell you, I'm a little contrarian on this point because having spent a lot of my time developing relationships with local leaders, I would say we've always had a hell of a bunch. We got a lot of talented people. I'm going to meet with a guy today who was a 3-time mayor of the second largest tax base in Mississippi in the 90s and 2000s, who I marvel at what he was able to accomplish in local government. And I know dozens of people like that. So I would say sometimes our sense that there's a lack of a bench is a matter of us not looking as closely and only paying attention to Congress people or governors or legislators and not considering or someone who's done a bang up job on the school board for a couple of terms. Anyway, putting that aside, to your real question, you're right. Absolutely. These people who do these jobs, they go on to be in a position to run for a regional and state office. And that's, I can't break news here on your podcast because it's his candidacy to announce, but there's a person who we did an IE for in our first round of IEs 4 years ago who was strongly looking at running for Senate, United States Senate, and will be a formidable candidate, not expect to run. And so we're seeing some of that just in the short time that we have been doing this work. We're already beginning to see people who we helped years ago, only a short time ago, for regional, county, local office, who are contemplating bigger things. So we're already seeing that. I think anyone who's wondering about whether or not this model might do what you just described, I would love to talk to them because we we're seeing it now.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think I'd kind of like to end with a big picture question, and it relates to that sense of the new Southern majority. Obviously, I mean, you've been in the Mississippi Legislature. You've got a pretty granular sense of where politics are at across the South right now. How do things look to you? Because certainly, I live in Tennessee, which has a very conservative supermajority in the legislature. My experience in my time in Tennessee has been sort of watching the state become progressively move farther and farther right, become sort of more and more authoritarian. So, where are we? What does that new Southern majority look like, and how achievable is that?
Some of my favorite legislators in the past 20 years have been Tennesseans. So, and my wife is from Memphis. So I love Tennessee and care about it, and have been dismayed at the hard rightward turn that it's taken. And frankly, the prospect of winning statewide office in Tennessee is a lot less likely for a progressive than it would be in Mississippi, which may surprise people. And look, all the things that we were concerned about with the current administration, we're seeing played out, and it's even more dismaying and existential because they seem to be more efficient this time around, and more effective at accomplishing some of their policy goals. So I understand anyone who is a little bit down right now. But that's why, Jesse, we encourage people to step back and look at this local. Even though I've been in politics for 20 years, I was shocked whenever we started to do our research on local opportunities in the South to just sit back and see how many places had competitive opportunities at the local level in the thousands. In just the 5 states I'm talking to you about, we saw 10,000 jurisdictions that could have competitive opportunities. And at that table, at that moment, we said, this is what we're going to be doing for the next 10 years. We're going to be going to some portion of this map as best as we can. And I have found it very life-affirming and very, exciting. I care deeply about making the South more progressive. I think our ideas work out better for people and families, and people who have been marginalized over the course of decades, and helpful in undoing some of this odious groundwater that we live in here in the Deep South. So I can't think of much more exciting than to try to bring some good government into a place that has been just riddled with bad government for decades and generations. So turning that focus to local races, turning that focus to what's in your area. We have a resource called the Southern Local Election Dashboard, SLED, which we make readily available to partners and groups who are pulling in the same direction. And the benefit of that dashboard is it takes our 5 states and will direct you to these competitive opportunities I just mentioned. Any jurisdiction you see pop up in there is one that we believe is competitive. And we would be happy to work with anybody who is curious about learning more about opportunities in the backyard and learning more about those things. So to me, to answer your question about prospect, that gives me a lot of hope. This is exciting work. It's something, as we think about the Serenity Prayer, it's something I can actually influence. I cannot do much about whatever the hell Elon Musk is doing. I don't, they're not listening to Jackson, Mississippi. But what I can do is work to elect progressive mayor in Alabama or Florida or Georgia. And then when you say, well, what does that mean for the future? Well, for us as progressives, I think we have to be honest and say, if we're not doing the basic blocking and tackling, those things that we just mentioned conservatives have been doing for decades, why would we expect to have amazing electoral results? To me, I see part of what we're doing is doing something that should have been done a long time ago, trying to make up ground, bring other people into this type of work. And when we do that, I feel pretty confident we'll have success. So I'm bullish on the long-term future, but understand why people are upset in the moment. But But again, the best way to get over the Trump blues is to turn local, in my opinion.
Right. All right. Well, I think that's a great place to wrap up. And so I guess if people want to get information about any of this, they can go to the various websites. I know both the Action Fund and the Super PAC have their own websites with resources and so forth, right?
Yeah, that's right. And you're welcome to use my Action Fund email address. I love talking to folks who are interested in getting more involved and who might be feeling down. I don't want people who care about this stuff to spend their time in, agony. So I'm always up for a conversation with people who are trying to figure out what's something I can do to feel better and to help my community. So Brandon.Jones@splcactionfund.org. Happy to hear from you.
All right. Great. Well, thanks again. I really appreciated the conversation.
Thank you, Jesse. Appreciate what you do.
Hey, it's time for AthFest. Athens, Georgia is home to the University of Georgia, a bunch of good bands like REM and the B-52s, a great dive bar called Manhattan Cafe with a very good cocktail menu, and, this weekend, AthFest. AthFest is a summer arts and music festival that livens up the college town during the quiet summer months. Created in 1997, the festival runs this Friday through Sunday, June 20th to 22nd. You can find information on its website at athfest.com. It will feature more than 70 artists selected through a juried process, along with dozens of musical performers headlined by the rapper Bubba Sparxxx. Besides 3 outdoor stages programmed throughout each day, on Friday and Saturday nights the festival continues with a club crawl through Athens' lively music venues, which will all have full rosters of live music. There's also a whole block called Kids Fest with children's activities and performers. The festival was originally organized by the Athens Convention and Visitors Bureau and the Athens Downtown Development Authority. It has been its own nonprofit since 2009. It does good in the community, too. Beyond providing a weekend of activities, it raises money to support arts education in local schools. Last year, the total topped $100,000. So if you're in or around Athens this weekend, you'll have plenty to do. And that wraps us up for this week. Remember, the Progressive South is a nonprofit media outlet, and you can find information about contributing to our efforts on our website, theprogressivesouth.org. If you do feel moved to make a donation, first of all, thank you. And second, make sure you make a note in the comments accompanying it that it is for the Progressive South. Thanks to Bark for our theme music, and to Lord Seth the Libertarian for his production work at Barbarian Productions. And thanks to you for listening. Remember, you can call and say hey from wherever you are. Just leave us a message at 865-214-7764. That's 865-214-PROG. Tell us your first name, where you're calling from, and take up to a minute to let us know what's going on where you are. We'll talk to you soon.